Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking one of the most fascinating geopolitical turnarounds we've seen in recent history. And honestly, it was driven entirely by the cold, hard mathematical realities of global energy, physical geography, and sheer crisis management. We're talking about the massive disruption in the Strait of Hormuz and how it literally forced one of the world's largest economies to pivot its entire energy strategy, almost overnight. The stakes here? They're incredibly high. We're dealing with global superpowers, rapidly shifting alliances, and just the absolute fragility of international supply chains.
Because right here is the central irony of our entire analysis today. Think about it. How exactly does a conflict in the Middle East end up reviving energy ties between New Delhi and Moscow? And get this, not just reviving them, but doing so with the explicit blessing of the United States, the very same country that had been fighting tooth and nail to sever those exact ties. Okay, let's dive into this and look at the hard data behind this remarkable shift.
Section 1. The Hormuz Shock and India's Geographic Vulnerability.
So looking at the first quarter of 2025, a massive 53% of all India's imported oil came directly from Middle Eastern suppliers. We're talking primarily Iraq and Saudi Arabia here. And I want to emphasize this heavily. This wasn't about some clever market hedging or diversifying portfolios. No, this was straightforward, undeniable geographic dependence. India's refineries are literally built to run on Gulf crude. And that physical reality meant they had direct, immediate exposure to any instability in the region.
And when we put a hard number on that exposure, wow, it is staggering. 2.1 million barrels per day. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, that is exactly how much crude oil was flowing into India through the Strait of Hormuz right before the crisis hit. I mean, just imagine a pipeline carrying 2.1 million barrels every single day. And then it just suddenly vanishes. That is a massive, crushing weight on an industrial economy that desperately needs that fuel just to keep the lights on and the factories running. But, India wasn't alone in this vulnerability. If we zoom out and look at the historical flow data from 2020 all the way to 2024, the top destinations for all the oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz were consistently just these four nations: China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Together, these countries accounted for well over half of all the volumes passing through this incredibly narrow waterway. So India's struggle to keep its energy grid alive, it's actually part of a much wider, systemic Asian pattern of dependence. So the crucial point is this. When the Strait of Hormuz faces a disruption, it isn't the West that suffers the immediate energy starvation, it's Asia. This single geographical choke point disproportionately holds Asian energy grids hostage. You really have to keep that reality in mind, because it perfectly sets the stage for the massive diplomatic collision that was about to happen.
Section 2. The pre-war pressure came toll.
Because for 10 solid months leading up to the crisis, the United States was running a highly focused, intense pressure campaign against New Delhi. The goal was simple, but, well, definitely not easy. Force India to drastically reduce its imports of Russian crude oil. Washington was heavily sanctioning Russian energy companies during this period and making it crystal clear to India that continuing these massive purchases could seriously jeopardize their bilateral relations. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the U.S. pressure campaign was actually working. Before the campaign started, Russia accounted for 36% of Indian oil imports. But by early 2026, that number had successfully been pushed down to 31%. India was complying. They were carefully navigating their diplomatic relationship with Washington and actively distancing their energy grid from Moscow. The U.S. sanctions policy was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Section 3. The Washington Reversal. And then, suddenly, everything flipped on an incredibly tight timeline. On February 28, 2026, the Iran war officially begins, effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz. Practically overnight, India loses its primary Middle Eastern supply line. Then, just 5 days later, 5 days, on March 5th, the Trump administration steps in and grants India a 30-day waiver to purchase, wait for it, Russian oil. In less than a week, a Middle Eastern conflict forced an immediate, total reversal of nearly a year of hard-fought U.S. sanctions policy. And the official justification for this waiver? It's fascinating. It was issued, quote, to stabilize global energy markets after Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, just think about the irony here for a second. Washington had spent 10 months painstakingly building this wall of sanctions against Russia, only to turn around and deliberately tear a hole right in that very same wall. Why? Simply because they couldn't control a separate choke point crisis. The U.S. essentially had to defeat its own sanctions to solve a global market panic. And let me tell you, the floodgates opened immediately. 300 million barrels. That is the massive volume of oil that Russia supplied to the international market between the issuing of those waivers and May 2026. Because of the Hormuz shock, India, alongside a surge of fresh demand from Southeast Asia, re-emerged aggressively as a major buyer of Russian crude. The whole distancing effort, it was over. The taps were completely back on.
Section 4, the China comparison.
So you might be wondering, why was India forced into this desperate, reactive position in the first place? To understand that, we just have to look next door. And this brilliantly illustrates the difference between proactive and reactive geopolitical strategy. It's a perfect mirror image. On one side, Beijing spent an entire decade, 10 years, building up strategic reserves and overland pipelines for this exact nightmare scenario of a closed strait. On the other side, New Delhi entered the crisis with direct, unmitigated exposure. They literally had no buffer. So when the strait closed, India had to scramble reactively, and their only lifeline was to revive the very relationship with Moscow that Washington had just spent a year trying to destroy.
Section 5, zero-sum strategic priorities.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an impossible choice for global superpowers. The United States basically found itself trapped in a zero-sum game. On one hand, you have priority number 1, enforce strict global sanctions against Russia, right? But on the other hand, priority number 2, ensure the fundamental energy security of a vital strategic partner, India. When the Strait of Hormuz closed, those two massive priorities just crashed right into each other. Washington simply could not have both.
And this is the stark reality of what happened. The U.S. chose to lose ground on its sanctions enforcement to protect its allies' energy grid. A physical, geographic choke point essentially overpowered a global superpower's diplomatic agenda. Actually, it's pretty wild. Washington was forced to facilitate the sale of Russian oil just to keep India's economy from completely stalling out. It is a stunning, undeniable example of exactly how fragile global policies can be when raw energy needs are on the line. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. How can great powers actually maintain rigid global sanctions when geographic choke points can so easily hold global energy security hostage? You know, sometimes the map dictates the politics, not the other way around. Thank you so much for joining me on this Explainer, Shrey. I highly encourage you to keep questioning those fragile links that hold our global markets together. See you next time.